Hello and welcome to another video. My name's Ben Hales with Transform My Poker, and today I have a special for all of you live players out there wanting to get the most from your horrible, ugly dealer. No, of course we're not doing that. I apologise to all you live players. This is a video that is going to be aimed squarely at the online player, and you all know, I'm sure, that HUD stands for Heads Up Display, common abbreviation, and it's that piece of software that sits on top of the poker software client that you're using and displays statistics and information about your opponents and their frequencies of how they bet in order to help you to exploit them. I'm going to try and give some information on the very basic level and go right through to a few more advanced points, and you'll have a look at the heads-up display that I like to use, and I'll give you some insight into how that helps me. When you first start building your HUD, these are my 5 tips. First up, less is more. So what this means is you don't want to put lots of information on your HUD at the beginning. You're going to get confused during this process, and you want to limit that confusion. You also want to make sure your screen is not cluttered up with information that you're not using. You need to understand every number that goes onto that heads-up display. So start with just 2 or 3 or 4 numbers. I recommend using YouTube or the frequently asked questions on the Holder Manager or Poker Tracker websites to help you to build the heads-up display. But I do recommend doing it yourself. There is a temptation to just use someone else's HUD, and I think that is a dangerous thing to do. It can be a good shortcut, but you need to be committed to understanding the HUD. And I think the best way of understanding it is investing some time in it yourself. And there's no substitute for actually building your own. Then it's personalized. It's the information that you want displayed how you want it displayed. The 2 numbers, VPIP and PFR, so voluntarily put money into the pot percentage and pre-flop raise percentage. These 2 numbers form at least 80% of everything that you should be thinking about in terms of your opponent's profile. These numbers are everything, because everything is understood within the context of, oh, and they're playing that range of hands. Remember that when we're talking about hand ranges, they're linear, so they start off wide and they narrow as the hand progresses. If you are thinking about some action on the turn, you really need to understand that action in the context of what that person's range was pre-flop. So all the pre-flop information is paramount to everything that you're thinking about. VPIP and PFR, these are the 2 numbers that I spend at least 80% of my time thinking about when I'm using my HUD. The next point I want to make is to understand sample size. This is going to be an ongoing process, but do not ignore it. You need to really get to grips with what it means to have 10 hands of information, 100 hands of information, 1,000 hands of information. For VPIP and PFR, 100 hands is quite a good sample. You're going to know roughly what type of opponent you've got there. It's really useful, but to understand how likely they are to bet the river, well, 100 hands is meaningless. You may have 0 examples, or you may have 1 example. You're not likely to have more than 3 or 4. So it's just not a big enough sample size. So for each individual statistic that you display, you want to know how many examples you've got, and that is called the sample size. Often I don't allow my HUD to display information where there's a sample size of less than 6 or 7. The final tip I have for building your HUD is to use colours. Make it visually attractive to you and make those colours make sense. I use a simple colour scheme. I have green, which means generally a bit loose, orange, which means in the normal zone, red, which means generally a bit tight, and then I have a wilder color for some really outrageous statistics, which I put in a crazy sort of pink purple color. That works for me, just a simple color code. So if I look down at the HUD and I see lots and lots of green, I know I've got a player who's probably going to be quite a loose player. And then if I see a red one, I know that they're playing too tight. And then orange would mean fairly normal. And if there's lots of pink or purple dotted around, I know I've probably got a wild fish. Okay, so that was building your HUD. Now I want to talk about using your HUD. There's some overlap. My first point here is one I've made already. So please start with just 2, 3, or 4 pieces of information. Become a master at profiling your opponents based on VPIP and PFR. This is so much more valuable to you than putting lots of information on your HUD that is misleading to you. I've listened to so many people who are profiling opponents based on all sorts of wild information, and I'm sat thinking, no, you're going too far with this. You're going into too much depth when what you should be doing is stripping it back and thinking on a simpler level about VPIP and PFR, because this is where the depth of the information comes from. All right, and so if you take one thing away from this video, please listen to the point that you should stick to a really simple heads-up display to start with until you're really comfortable with it. Now, as you go along, so once you've been playing for a while and you've been getting used to the HUD as it is, that's when you can start making changes to it. And you can do, if you're playing every day, you can do this quite regularly. You know, if you're feeling really good about how you're understanding the HUD, you can make changes a couple of times a week. You can put in new statistics, just 1 at a time or 2 at a time. Don't make sweeping changes. Make sure that you are using each and every number on there. Okay, I think it's good to be chopping and changing things up, but it's not good to make massive changes. Okay, so keep things simple again with the changes. Sample size. I've got another drum I want to beat, and that's why it's on the second slide as well. You've got to know about the sample size on the HUD. You've got to know, first of all, how many hands you have on someone. So the HUD should display the number of hands of information. But not only that, you can, on your HUD, have, for each number, you can know what the sample size is. For me personally, I don't like displaying a number unless I've got a certain number of hands of information for that number. So it might be that, you know, I don't want to know about how often this person donk bets unless I've got 10 examples. So I won't allow the HUD to display the information until such time. You can also have it faded out for smaller sample sizes. You can have it in different colors. There's loads of ways of customizing your heads-up display to give you a clue about sample size. But don't ignore sample size. Drum beat. Fourth point, pop-up boxes. You may not know what a pop-up box is. The heads-up display are the boxes that appear on the HUD at all times. They're fixed. But the pop-up boxes can come up when you click or perhaps when you hover over a certain number. And I'll show you these in a second. These display more detail of information. And I'll give you a good example of how you might use that. And my final point for a general tip for using your HUD, don't let the HUD make your decision. The HUD is there to give you guidance about who your opponent is and what his tendencies are. But the situation in front of you is a fresh, new one. You need to use your brain to interpret the information and make a smart choice. So the HUD is a guide only. It never makes a decision. Let's now have a look at my HUD and discuss a few numbers. Welcome to Holder Manager and the heads up display. So this one is Harrington Basic number 2, and I think it's quite a good one for beginners. If you're too lazy to build your own, choose something like this. It's just got this VPIP and PFR with the abbreviations there to help, and you don't need to worry about much else. You've got number of hands, you've got aggression factor, but really you're just focused on learning how to use these two numbers, VPIP and pre-flop raise. So that one is going to work well for beginners. If you like graphs instead of numbers, this is quite useful. It's not for me, but there's graph options from the Holder Manager defaults. For more advanced players, you can customize something to really suit you, and it might look something like this. If you're playing heads up poker, then you're going to want to divide things up by how people behave in and out of position, and that's what this heads up display does. Please don't worry about all the numbers here right now. I'm just showing you what this can look like. Okay, this is what I like to use, so this one, and I don't have abbreviations because I know what each number does. All right, I'm used to using it. I know that it starts with number of hands, number of big blinds, VPIP, pre-flop raise, and then there's 3 more pre-flop statistics. I use steal percentage, fold to steal, and 3-bet percentage. You can see mine there, 7.3. And as you go around, you can get an idea of behavior already from these numbers. So the 2 guys in the top left have got extremely low 3-bet numbers, and they're in red. And yet these are the loose passive players at the table with high VPIP and relatively low pre-flop raise. So they're the players already that I'm thinking, oh, okay, they may be the fish on the table just based off the pre-flop numbers. Okay. I tell you what, let's just play a hand and we'll discuss some of these numbers. I haven't got time to go through each and every one of them, and so let's just see what happens in this hand. Okay, so we get a raise from the hijack, and button, small blind and big blind all call. It's a min raise in a 6 max sit and go. I folded. Okay, so well, the initial raiser raises 16% of hands. If we look into this using a pop-up box, I can see how often this player raises from the hijack. So mid position, 25%. There doesn't seem to be much positional awareness going on. This player just likes to play around 20% of his hands, and yeah, there's not a lot of positional awareness, and that's what I'm using the pop-up box to display. I could do the same on mine. You could look at my breakdown. So okay, pre-flop raise, early 10, mid 15, cutoff 19, button 29. So you're seeing a huge increase based on position. So you would note that I had positional awareness. Some players do, some players don't. But what this really tells me is that the 16% doesn't really matter which position he's in. He's raising about 16% of his hands. So we know his range isn't position dependent. Really useful information. Let me press on. So the callers call as they're likely to, and we hit the flop. Okay, there's a donk bet lead and a raise and a fold. Okay, so what does the donk bet mean? Well, I've got that statistic right here. This 23 that I'm hovering over. I'll click on that and I get a, oh dear, no I don't. Yes I do. This is in the green there. You see donk bet. That displays how often that a player likes to lead out in a part out of position, having been a pre-flop defender. And it's quite a big symbol of who's likely to be the fish on the table, someone with a high donk bet percentage. You'll see around the table this number is 0, 7, we don't know, 0 and 36. The one where we don't know, we've not got enough examples. So that's why it's not displayed. Okay, if I've not got 10 examples of something, I don't want to know. I don't want it distracting me and confusing me and misleading me into a bad decision. But what I can see is that the two players in the top left are leading out too often, and therefore they're most likely making lots of post-flop mistakes, and their range for donk betting is much wider than someone who knows what they're doing is. So the raise from the hijack's fairly normal with most of his range, I would think, and the jack of hearts drops, and now we get check and bet again. I think this bet again with most of his range is normal, and he calls again, so that's a bit worrying that he would continue to call a large bet. Five of spades on the end, check, so either a misdraw or was a bit weak to start with, maybe a really small pocket pair, 3, a 5, or yeah, possibly an 8, and okay, decides not to make a value bet, and let's have a look. So pocket 9s probably could have made a value bet, but was probably going to get some calls from 8x. I guess he's worried by the 5 on the river. Maybe he didn't think he had value, but that's all another discussion. Really, what I want to get from this is simply the use of the heads-up display to analyze people's behavior, people's tendencies, and in this particular hand, the kind of numbers I'm looking at, and some brief use of the pop-up boxes to get to grips with people's ranges. I hope you found that useful, me just rabbiting on about numbers. Give it a Facebook like, and any questions, I think there's going to be a few on this one. Any questions, just drop them in the boxes below and I will try and get back to you. Okay? Thanks very much for listening. My name's Ben Hales with Transform My Poker.